coming up this week?
CBRE, while yes, we are primarily known as a brokerage company and a real estate company, we are the largest project management company in the world. We are doing significant work from helping, whether they're building gigafactories, battery plants, infrastructure for EV, offices, etc.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 180 of the EV Resource Podcast. I'm Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and interviews with industry experts. And this week is no different. I'm having a conversation with Jim Hurless. He is CBRE's global real estate leader for electric vehicle infrastructure. Jim, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I am really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have because I imagine that a lot of what we're going to talk about are just not things that people are aware of.
Well, I appreciate you for having me. And yes, the real estate aspect is oftentimes forgotten and overlooked.
Very much so, I'm sure. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to give you a chance to speak to your background and share about how you came to your current role with CBRE.
That's great. No, thank you for that. I appreciate this opportunity. So, I've been with CBRE for 8 years, but prior to coming and joining CBRE, I was with a large company logistics company and also had data centers. And my role there was helping them to deploy large, complex infrastructure into countries that didn't currently operate. So my entire background has always been in, well, quite honestly, problem solving for complex situations and scenarios of whether I was building a data center that has large power requirements and other infrastructure components tied to that. Where should they go? Why should they be there? Answering a lot of these questions so that our companies could then in turn invest in those areas and those regions. Fast forward to my time here at CBRE, a couple of years ago, our leadership team had reached out, and a colleague of mine and myself, and said, our clients are really starting to transition their fleets from combustion engine over to electric vehicle. How do we go about supporting them? What is the impact on their real estate? What is the impact on their business models, and how can we help them? What are the problems we're seeing in the space tied to the electrification process? It's not just as simple as here's a new electric vehicle, now go about your day. Since March of 21, when we kicked this project off and this opportunity within CBRE, a business line, we've been able to really expand our capabilities to support public charging infrastructure, charge point operators or CPOs that are putting chargers out for the public use, as well as supporting our fleet clients and third-party fleet operators as well, that we're able to help identify where the infrastructure is today, where can we deploy as quickly as possible, and what does a roadmap look like for us overall to deploy this infrastructure needed.
Boy, where do we begin, right? I mean, that's spectacular. Clearly, you are taking an approach related to just business overall of really asking questions to identify a number of various things that a client might need, but then also might not be aware of themselves, where they might not even be able to ask the right questions. So it kind of falls on you as the expert to then really ask those questions of them to kind of narrow it down and make a plan that would work best for whoever they might be, whether, like you said, whether it's a CPO or fleet customers, or, I mean, ultimately anybody that's looking to make a big shift in their transportation to need some EV charging.
Yes, absolutely. The ultimate goal for CBRE and our mission as building this organization is really helping to deploy charging infrastructure to help drive EV adoption and help increase the number of EVs that are on the road today. And we find that the best way for us to serve that mission is really to be that consultative approach when we're talking to end users, or if we're working with those third-party charging operators. Where is the right place? What is the right order that we should be deploying these and prioritizing, say, for example, a portfolio. That's really the biggest differentiator when we look at CBRE is the relationships as being the world's largest real estate firm. We have a lot of relationships with developers, investors, site owners, and then also occupiers that are looking to bring charging infrastructure to their sites to attract more customers in a retail application or at a hospitality or hotel type of a location. And we're starting to be able to match and marry up the those properties with those site owners with the charging infrastructure provider themselves.
Sure. So I definitely feel like we can split the conversation into two parts primarily. One focused on fleets that have existing real estate, but obviously, if they're going to introduce any kind of higher powered EV charging, they're going to need some help along the way to figure out how that would work. And then the second part would be for the CPOs, where they would be looking for real estate either to purchase or potentially lease from somebody that is already existing in an ideal location. So let's start with the fleet side of things. What is the typical customer that approaches CBRE when they have a question or they're looking for help related to converting a fleet over and needing that resource of being able to refuel with electrons?
Yes, that's a great question. There's a significant amount to it, as you can imagine. There's a lot to talk about when we talk about the capital expenses by itself, a lot of impacts on a real estate portfolio, and we'll go in a little bit deeper on each of these topics.
Mhm.
The type of charging solution and the mix of a fleet that they have. So if I take a step back, and the first thing I oftentimes do when I talk to a fleet owner of an organization or a company, whether it's last mile or whether it's Joe's Plumbing around the corner that is electrifying their fleet, we ask a couple of questions to primarily start to look at the whole scale, because very rarely do we just charge a fleet without the workplace being electrified as well. For the employees that come, they want to electrify their vehicles while so there's always a larger sustainability and a larger program opportunity than just pure fleet. But as we focus on the fleet, a lot of the things we look at is helping our clients understand commercial impacts of that transition from miles per gallon to miles per kilowatt. What is that commercial impact on my profitability, and how should I optimize or consider changing routes or travel habits and change management for my drivers to learn how to drive an EV over a combustion engine as an example. The other aspect is understanding the current situation within their location, their distribution center with their facility, and then their overall portfolio. And what I mean by that is I have a client in a real scenario that transitioned 20 Class 8 diesel trucks in over for 20 electric vehicle Class 8s. And what we learned in that scenario, and what they learned very quickly, it's not an even swap. If I can fit 20 Class 8s into a parking lot and I transition to electric, I can no longer get 20 vehicles, because now I have charging stations, bollards, transformers, turning radiuses to consider, and being able to maneuver in and around those charging stations themselves. So we have to start to take a look at their strategy on deploying that infrastructure, or that the infrastructure and the vehicles, and have that conversation of, now, does it make sense for us to charge and park these vehicles on site at that location, or partner with somebody or park off site and charge off site as an alternative? Because again, it's not a one-to-one ratio. There's a loss of a lot of efficiency in these parking yards. The other consideration, and this is a big one, the weight of electric vehicles is significantly higher, almost 28,000 pounds difference between an electric Class 8 and a diesel Class 8. Parking structures at a lot of these distribution centers, they can't support the weight of all of those vehicles. The loading bays can't support the weight of those vehicles. So there's a need for reinforcing. And these are struggles that are eye openers, and sadly, in some circumstances, may not be thought of far enough in advance for the planning process. And then, not lastly, there's a lot of other components that go in there, but, trying to keep on track. What is the power situation at that location? So when we look at the power, how far are we from a substation? Can we get service delivered to your address? Add an additional panel, obviously, for the additional use. Will my landlord even allow us to add this infrastructure? What does restoration look like at the end of the lease? So once we start to have these kind of conversations and some dialogue back and forth about overall thoughts and strategy, we'll oftentimes come back to them and say, based on your strategy and what your goals are, it may make sense to consider offsite versus onsite, as outlined earlier, or it may make sense to focus on delivering your vehicles to this region of the country, to these offices, and slow play another part of the country or another part of the state, just due to capacity from the substations, and it may take time to bring in additional service to that location. So it's very important that we take all of those factors into consideration as we help our clients with this transition process. And then lastly, I should say, CBRE also, through our internal CBRE investment management group, offers a lot of these financing opportunities for our clients. So we had a client that was only able to transition about 100 vehicles a year because of the capital outlay. Well, we offered a financing mechanism through our organization that allowed them to increase their transition up 400, 450 vehicles a year,
Wow.
and allowed them to hold their capital and invest in other areas that would yield a different return.
Sure, sure. And as most of my audience probably already knows, the savings involved with an electric vehicle likely is going to be more than if they did have interest on a loan. It's still going to benefit them to finance that versus digging into whatever their cash on hand might have been. So that's excellent that you guys offer the creative solutions where it sounds like you're a one stop shop. Clearly, you guys are involved a lot with consultation. Do you get into project management and handling pretty much everything for your clients?
I love this question, and I appreciate you throwing me a softball like this, Zach. No, you're absolutely correct. So CBRE, we truly do look at this as delivering a holistic approach and strategy. So we have broken EV charging into three primary buckets. And the first bucket is where we are focused on the real estate strategy, the consulting, incentives, collecting as much incentives as possible, securing site properties, and just really overall building that consultancy around helping with that real estate portfolio and that transition so that our clients can reach those goals ultimately with sustainability. Our second bucket is what we refer to as designing and building. CBRE, while yes, we are primarily known as a brokerage company and a real estate company, we are the largest project management company in the world. We are doing significant work from helping building gigafactories, battery plants, infrastructure for EV, et cetera. In that scenario, we're able to help our clients through the feasibility due diligence study once we present sites to validate those sites are operational. They do site walks, they put together construction budgets from permitting all the way through that activation of the hardware, including the purchase of a lot of the hardware itself. And then in our third bucket, we have our operations and maintenance, which is really truly making sure that your network is monitored and has uptime, that it aligns with whether we're talking NEVI, it has to be 97% uptime, or if it's government agency or a tier one priority company that has an electric fleet that has to be running 100% of the time, making sure that those charging networks are up and running. CBRE has made some investments. We have a joint venture investment in Jacksonville, Florida, where we have a testing lab for various numbers of charging hardware, AC and DC, where we're actually testing them, playing with them. How does this work? What's the user experience look like? So that we can take that data in-house and support our clients to have a better outcome for the end user, for whether it's for you and me and our electric vehicles, or it's for a fleet user, making sure that the experience is optimal. In addition to that, we'll be doing not only the testing of that hardware, but the training and certification of our maintenance technicians. We are also a very, very large facilities management company, if not the largest in the world there as well, where we are working with our maintenance technicians. We have about 23,000 of them out on the road right now, as an example, to help them learn how to repair charging equipment so that if there is an outage, we can dispatch somebody very quickly. And we've built a network operating center to do exactly that. Monitors all of the networks that we've installed on behalf of charge point operators, and they are helping to monitor those networks, learning predictive maintenance on a lot of these chargers and cables. For example, if we see that there's a weather pattern coming over Arizona and we have a big dust storm, we know that we're going to have to send out some techs to clean up the area to make sure that there's free and clear access to the plugs. There's no clogged plugs, anything like that. We overlay a lot of our data around those types of weather anomalies or other circumstantial issues that may arise, and it will flag us to be prepared to support that equipment to ensure operability and reliability.
I'm floored at the extent of everything that you just said. The first thing that pops into my head is, what do you guys not do?
Yeah. We do not sell electrons. We are not in the business of owning and operating our own network. We're in the business of building out networks on behalf of operators, charging operators, so that we can, again, really build networks that are reliable and consistent with uptime and available for everybody, regardless of area or communities. We want everybody to have access to charging.
Well, I mean, certainly we can agree on just about all of that for sure. Uh, when it comes to your ideal customers, is there a limit to how big a project could get? Could you handle somebody like Amazon converting their fleet over? Is there an upper limit, really?
There is not an upper limit. And while I can't disclose certain logos and brands that we work with, we are
Naturally.
absolutely very familiar with all of the large fleet operators, as well as the large third-party charging operators for public and for the
Mhm.
fleet. We have 2 or 3 clients right now that are actually global, where we're helping them and supporting them both in Europe and in America, the US and Canada, I should say. So, there is a lot of scale and a lot of momentum right now.
That is very true, especially in areas outside of North America. There has been for quite a while. I've often said that China, a lot of Asia, or really Europe, are years ahead of where the United States has been. From a global aspect, have you noticed that those numbers have kind of followed a pattern where you've seen most of the work in Europe or China, and now North America, as the last couple of years people are talking about it more, things are picking up. Would you agree with that?
I do. When you look at Europe, there are 6 primary markets in Europe where the trend, especially when we're talking about public charging in passenger vehicles, there are really 6 markets, and in many of those markets, they're seeing 20% or higher percent growth in EV sales years over year, and even percentages of new vehicles being sold. They're sitting at 20. You look at Denmark population, I get it's a little bit different, but they're around 41% of the new vehicles sold last year were EV. We do see a lot of that happening. We're seeing APAC. There's about 6 markets in APAC that are really doing well.
Just to clarify, in case somebody doesn't know APAC, that would be Asian Pacific.
Yes, yes, thank
Okay.
you. It's really interesting when we talk about Asia Pacific and that part of the world. The governments are playing a huge role, and by far, China is probably the largest market in the world. Very complex, very challenging to work there, but if you can get it to work, it's a fantastic market. And when you look at other markets like Singapore and India, where you have governments really pushing for electrification, and in India, it's more on the public transportation, the buses, because of affordability. And so I'm seeing governments globally starting to really take advantage of electrification in ways that make sense for consumers and economic considerations for the passenger vehicles themselves, or for the public as well.
What are the biggest challenges that you might encounter working with a customer? And I'd like to add a second question to that. Also, are there certain geographic regions that you've found are more challenging than others?
Great question. I've worked with certain municipalities in really great locations that are extremely difficult to work with. So
Sure.
it is to generalize, I would say that Some of the more challenging locations would definitely be in markets that are a little bit undeveloped or don't necessarily understand what they're doing. So it's typically going to be a tier two kind of a market consideration, if you will.
Hmm.
And I say a tier two, that South America in general is a pretty challenging place to build out a charging infrastructure and a network. And I mentioned municipalities. I'm always still a little bit surprised at, take California as an example. We've worked with some municipalities that just didn't know how to zone a property to allow for electrification. And there's a long process, and you go in front of city council and you try to, you don't try, you sell them on the benefits and the value of having the EV infrastructure, and you're identifying these charging deserts, if you will. And a lot of them, you can map them, and they really do almost cross-reference with some of those markets or municipalities that struggle with the value add of an EV charging hub versus a traditional fueling station, if you will.
Hmm. Sure. With what we've been used to for the last 100 years, it hasn't been these mega locations where you can have 100 vehicles refueling at once. It's been much more distributed when it comes to the infrastructure and the network there, where we're seeing kind of that development with EVs. But to your point, there are definitely some areas where it makes a lot of sense from a simplicity and cost perspective to just put it all in one spot and then build out from there. So when you do run into certain challenges, naturally you're going to be interacting with third party agencies. You mentioned some municipalities or state level where you might get into the need for educating them, or I'm sure working through permitting processes is just so much fun to work with. What would you say is the strategy going in to be prepared for some of those hurdles that might come up?
Yeah, and a lot of that in the strategies that we'll oftentimes take is reinforcing the safety of electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging, the benefits in from a sustainability perspective of having the electric vehicle charging, and then we talk a lot around the number of renters within a market. Those are oftentimes we find that people that are renting multifamily homes or even single family homes may not have an electric vehicle charging station in their garage or in their parking location. So they're oftentimes looking for those what we can call a destination where there's DC fast charging available within a close proximity that they can then charge their vehicle or their version of a gas station, right? So we bring a lot of that to bear about how this location can service the fact that there's 52% of the households within a 5 mile radius of this location are renters. And of the EV adoption, we're seeing EV adoption on the rise. We're seeing so we come with data, we come with analytics, and we present that information to them. And then I would say the other component, not only the municipalities, is really the utility company as well. And that's pretty challenging in a lot of ways to engage with utility providers and have timely feedback on whether or not there's a specific amount of capacity at a certain substation. And if I need 3 megawatts day one, but I want to be able to grow my charging location to 5 megawatts, what's the process? What's the cost and the timeline to get it there? So there's a lot of collaboration between the municipalities are going to want to know that information. The utility company is going to want to know that information. And then obviously from a construction material costs, et cetera, we all have to be aligned with our mission and our messaging.
When you first said working with utilities was a challenge, you caught me off guard because naturally I would assume that utilities are very supportive and want to engage, in working through this type of process. But of course, you clarified that with timely, and so that makes a lot more sense. And I would imagine that some utilities are better than others in certain states that might be more friendly towards EVs than others. Here in Virginia, with Dominion Energy, we've been very fortunate that they're very forward thinking, and that we've even seen with a number of the regional cooperatives, the electric co-ops, even in rural areas, that this is something that is very much on their mind. They're talking about it quite a bit. And so knowing that you guys are very much engaged with certain entities from that perspective, not only have you already made a number of connections and have built relationships in these ways, but that it's something that is very much an important part of the process that you go through.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a true comment. We've done this, for a few years, and we have over 8,500 chargers that we've placed in the ground already. So it's given us. We continue to learn lessons every project that we do. There's always something that's a little bit different or a little bit more unique about one aspect than another, and it could be whether it's dealing with those third party groups, or if we're just really trying to focus on, making sure we have adequate space to build out infrastructure, right? So we have to make sure that we have enough room for all of those chargers to go into a retail strip center or into a travel center type environment along a corridor.
Yeah. So when a customer's coming to you, are they usually at a point where it's been a thought on their mind, but they haven't really taken any action? Or contrary to that, have you found that sometimes customers are coming and they've kind of gotten like halfway through and then they find that they're just stuck and they don't know what to do and they need help? I'm sure you've had both of those, but what would you say is kind of primarily the point that you guys start to enter a process?
So that's a great there, and I have to break that into two responses, because when we look at who a CBRE customer is, one is going to be the real estate aspect, those developers and site owners, or site hosts, if you will. They come to us oftentimes and say, Jim, here's my national portfolio. We have a lot of requests to electrify. We know it's the right thing to do. We want to electrify. We don't understand what that means. How many chargers do we put in? What type of charger? What's the right ownership model? Should I own and operate and sell electrons? Should I bring in a third party to do that? How do we really understand what to do and move forward? And in some of those scenarios, in more of those scenarios than not, we're seeing a lot of those landlords and those site host owners that own portfolios, especially, realize that they don't want to be caught in the middle of, well, my charger's not operating. I have to send somebody out. I have to figure out how to do this and do that.
Right.
And when you look at, I'm getting pennies a kilowatt. It's not as profitable as I want it to be. So how can I go about, is this the right decision? And I would say that over 95% of the portfolio, the real estate side, are looking to partner with those third party operators to come in, make that investment, and offer that penny or two a kilowatt hour to the landlord as a way of monetizing, quote unquote, rent for those parking spaces, if you
Sure.
will.
Hmm.
So there's that perspective, right, around consulting on what's the right way for us to do this as we look at an overall portfolio. The second customer class, you're going to find this pretty oddly unique, not really, is the third party operators. Their biggest struggle is finding portfolios of real estate. And we would deploy our infrastructure, but we're struggling. And they may have armies of salespeople, but a lot of those companies are picking off ones and twos. Like, here's, I'll take 321 Main over here and 452 8th Street over there, versus large portfolio wide solutions and opportunities to deploy infrastructure. In that scenario, with those third party operators, helping them grow to scale and meet their investor requirements, their own internal business requirements, whichever it might be for them. That's where we see them come and ask us for help. Is, can you introduce us? We have a database that we've built internally at CBRE with over 30,000 unique street addresses in Canada and the US, of portfolios that have come into Jim and CBRE team. Can you help us electrify our portfolio? And match us with those charge point operators. So that has been a real opportunity from both of our customer sides, is playing that matchmaker in between and solving for both needs, quite honestly.
I think that is a great segue. Let's actually kind of move and focus on CPOs, if you guys are approached by an existing network, they see that there's a need, electric vehicles are being adopted at a greater rate than the deployment of the infrastructure to support them. If we're going to be ready for the transition that we're currently experiencing, we have to have the infrastructure to support it. To your point, the real estate is the one thing that I don't want to say it's the most important, but it is a critical piece in that as a CPO, you're not going to make money operating in that space if you don't have chargers that are used. Real estate, location, 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 right? Like that is going to drive what kind of utilization they might see from a site. What is it that you guys do to really identify what locations are best?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the way that we actually go about this location intelligence and helping with our clients, the chart CPOs, we have a tool that again we developed in house called Dimension EV. It has been built upon our historic data and with CBRE being a brokerage firm and the years and decades of data and analytics that we have around what drives retail locations, what's a great retail location for a brand based on their business model and the demographic that they're going after. We've been able to lift and shift that methodology and those types of thought processes and applied them into the EV space. So in a lot of scenarios, the same things hold true. If you've seen a lot of these new passenger vehicle travel centers, they're upgraded significantly above and beyond that of like a traditional travel center that you would stop at for your gas station. That they're nicer lounge areas, higher end coffees, just a little nicer area because you're going to be there. You're going to be there a little bit longer. Uh, so the amenities that are around there, we're able to really hone in on real estate that meets the criteria of the demographic. And that's really the thought process that we're able to go in and really take our tool and build it for each individual CPO that says, based on your regional, your archetype, your key clients that you're going after for the type of an amenity or an experience, these are the portfolios that we see that align with your mission. And we're able to also create return on investment performance for them when we show them those individual properties as well. So we can say, if it's $150,000 at a median install for a DC charger, these are all the incentives that we can apply for: NEVI, state, local, utility incentives. We apply for them, we collect them. They get to use that to offset that capital cost. And then we're able to really help them build a business case to what I always say is validating their instincts on where they want to be.
So I want to go back just briefly, and I just wrote it down because I wanted to make sure that I touched on that. Some of these other incentives, that's been something that is a very complicated process. If you, as an individual or a CPO, don't have any experience in grant writing or applying for some of these things, did I hear you correctly that you guys will apply on behalf of your customer, your client?
Yes, surprise, another thing that CBRE does. So
That is a big, big deal. So I want to emphasize that.
it is, and CBRE has done incentives work for, again, decades, supporting our other clients around offices or examples of building a battery manufacturing facility. Where do we go? How do we get the most incentives from a state? What's the labor arbitrage look like in those scenarios? So we have that same group of people that are tracking all of the grants and incentives that are available nationally, and we're able to apply those on a street address level, and it can tell us exactly everything that we're eligible for. Is it a DC installation? Is it semi-public access? Is it fully public? There's a lot of grants and incentives in it, and it's our job to really help our clients understand what's available and if it fits in their business model. Again, making sure that it makes sense for them. It's not just only going after NEVI. It's not only going after first state funds. It's the entire basket of everything that's available. It's almost like shopping for scholarships for your child when they go off to college. You got to buy all of them.
Right, right. You got to look everywhere. It sounds like CBRE was in the perfect position with all of the experience across the board of a wide variety of things that you all had been doing for your clients. In many ways, what I'm hearing you say without you, the words that you're saying is you understand human needs and human behaviors. And that's something that, yes, obviously we're talking about how that applies to electric vehicle infrastructure, but really that could apply to, I would imagine, almost anything.
Yes, yeah, and permission to nerd out a little bit here,
Go for
but
it. Absolutely.
we actually contemplate something called right-hand turn biases when we score addresses. So, what is the likelihood as you're driving down an interstate and you exit at 54? Which location are you most likely to turn into? Are you the
Yeah.
northwest corner is absolutely out because I'm not going to turn left and then turn left back out to get back onto the interstate. We
Mm.
do take human bias in, and we understand that great that you have a vehicle that might have 300 miles of range or 200 miles of range, but you're not going to go 300 or 200 miles in between charges. You may have a dog in the back seat or a couple kids that want McDonald's and they're hungry now, and I need to stop somewhere and exercise the dog. So you're absolutely right. When we look at plotting out where charging infrastructure should go along transit, so for hub sites along corridors, we take into account a lot of those human bias on right-hand turn. On view shedding is another term that we use. Can I see the charging stations? How
Yeah.
many times have you pulled up to a Walmart because there's DC fast charging there,
Uh
and you're driving around the building going, "Where is this place?"
huh. I have had that happen so many times. Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people that are EV owners, it's almost impossible to have gone on a trip to an area you're not familiar with. Sure, you can use the app or maybe the in-car navigation to identify that there's a charger at that location, but where?
Right.
So, yes, no,
And it's a little
that's
sketchy. Sometimes I'm on the backside of a building because it's the closest to an electrical panel,
right.
right? So those struggles are real, and we absolutely take that into consideration when we are making recommendations to our clients on where to deploy that infrastructure, so that it's visible, it's safe, it's in the right spot that it's going to get noticed. And some of the other, if I can share just some of the challenges that we've seen, especially on the corridor side, um, you know, and it's changing a little bit. But as you may be aware, through when Eisenhower built our whole interstate infrastructure,
Mhm.
the rest areas were not allowed to sell anything. So
Right.
they couldn't put charging stations there. You're lucky if it has vending machines
Hmm.
for a soda or a water or whatever that might look like. I think those types of things need to change from the government to help, because those are great locations right as I'm crossing straight state lines,
Yes.
directions. Makes a ton of sense. You stretch your legs or walk your dogs, let your kids run around, whatever it is, have a picnic, whatever.
Hmm.
And then the other side is the highway signs is another area that I think we have to have some federal changes put in place around allowing us to advertise on those. It's you're only legally allowed to advertise gas,
Right.
lodging, and food. Electric charging doesn't count as gas, and it would be so helpful if we could put a little lightning bolt underneath a gas station's logo, or as part, just something that
Yeah.
can help us with wayfinding. And you're right, in apps or all the apps are great, but it'd be good to have a little extra.
Yes. This is funny, actually. I was talking about this in depth this past weekend where signage and visibility, the early adopters, from innovators to the early adopters, now that we're kind of getting into the early majority, they're more willing to use apps, multiple. They're more willing to drive around the entire mall to try to figure out where the chargers are, for crying out loud. But the next phase is, once we kind of cross the chasm here and get more into the majority of the adoption curve, they're not going to want to use apps. They might use the navigation in their car, but generally they're just going to drive and they want to see the sign for the exit and have it listed right there. I've always thought that we need a little bit more detail on the sign so that we know what kind of charging,
Valid.
because having a AC 240 volt right off the highway, having it on a sign isn't going to do anybody any good because they're not going to want to sit there for however long it takes. So those are policy issues. Those are things that need to be brought up both on a federal level, but also on state levels. Tell me that you guys aren't involved in helping or giving advice or counsel on that side of things as well, because it certainly sounds like you're doing
I
enough.
I should say that we'll talk to whoever will listen.
Okay.
So yeah, and we do support some of our CPOs that are in those circumstances, and always willing to help and leverage what we can with that. But largely, that is a conversation with the CPOs and the federal level more so than anything that we could influence from a real estate
Right.
company perspective.
Yeah. I mean, when you get into law and policy at any level, I mean, it could be your local municipality all the way up to a federal, the level of complexity just dramatically increases. And generally, I don't like politics, but I recognize that a lot of working in the EV space, it's almost unavoidable because we've built out the system in this country specifically to support gas powered cars. I mean, this country essentially, cities, connecting cities, everything was built centered around this model. So to even change it just by fuel type, you run into so many different things that are hurdles or challenges to overcome. If you're working with a CPO and let's say they have identified a specific site that they're really, really stuck on, but after talking with you, you guys bring in the data and everything else that you have to offer, and your recommendation is you probably shouldn't be at that site. Have you had situations like that come up, and what have you guys done to kind of work with the customer to walk through that solution?
Yeah, we've had that conversation as often as we have recommendations or sites that do work within a model. And once we walk through it, the truth of the matter is most of the CPOs, if not all, are very savvy individuals. Many of them are coming over from the solar world,
Mm-hmm.
so they're very aware of transmission and power and site acquisition and site selection, location intelligence. So they understand what makes a good solar spot. Doesn't always make a good EV spot, but the conceptual conversation around that is very similar on applying it to EV charging, where you need to make sure that you can get access from a substation, and you might have a great location and no actual real power from a substation. So microgrid strategies, if they're really stuck on areas like that, we can talk about microgrid and how can we offset that gap in utility that's required and what's actually on site. But we do absolutely have those conversations with clients around if they bring us a location, what makes it good or less attractive from a revenue perspective. And it could be EV adoption long term or the number of registered vehicles. It's not always a utility or a grid capacity issue, which oftentimes is the biggest issue that we face, especially DC deployment and fleet deployment, is oftentimes issues with the grid.
Sure, sure. So I know just from the short conversation that we've had thus far that we could absolutely go for multiple hours
Yeah,
talking about really diving into details. It sounds like you're able to handle just about any client that might reach out. And I would imagine that you don't often say you can't help.
that's correct. That is correct. And I will say that from an overall perspective, um, the more complex, the better we will be at CBRE to support. If you have a single location you want to put two chargers in, we're not very good at that.
Okay. Okay.
From that perspective, we can steer you in the right direction, but very typically we are into larger applications, and larger doesn't mean national. We're working with regional charter CPOs as well,
Sure.
and it's just again, the more complex, the more fun,
Okay.
and
The
better
bigger
we.
the challenge.
Yes,
Absolutely. Well,
yes.
Jim, I want to thank you again so much for taking your time to share all of this. This has been very enlightening for me. And so I know that anybody that will be watching or listening to this will very likely feel the exact same way that I do. There are not often times that I get very excited based on what I'm hearing because I can recognize how important the work that you all are doing is. And to achieve the larger goals that we have as a society, as a country, really as a planet, to take it back global here right at the end, we are going to need players involved exactly like you and exactly like CBRE.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Hope you have a
Thanks,
great
Zach.
day.
All right. Bye-bye.
I mean, wow. It is clear that CBRE offers such a comprehensive, really involved solution for electric vehicle charging and charging infrastructure. If you are a business owner or a fleet operator or even a CPO that is looking to make more connections in this space to further along really the shared mission that we all have of adopting electric transportation, then I really strongly encourage you to reach out to Jim and his team. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to CBRE's webpage. If you don't want to find it there, you can just Google CBRE EV charging and it should have their page pop up. But I'm going to make it easy. I'm going to have it in the show notes for you. And if you have any questions or comments, or anything related to this, or honestly, anything else EV related, you can email me or call into the EV resource hotline. And there are two easy ways to do that. You can first use your smartphone's built-in voice recorder, record a message, keeping it to 90 seconds or less if you would. And then you can email that in to hello@ev-resource.com. Or secondly, you can call the toll-free number anytime, day or night, and that is 1-844-387-2428. Again, that is 1-844-EVR-CHAT. And if you know somebody special with an upcoming birthday, anniversary, graduation, or another special occasion, you can give them the unique gift of recorded voices from friends and family telling them why they're special. The recordings can be podcasted or put onto a keepsake. For more information, you can visit lifeonrecord.com or just use the link in the show notes to learn more. Before we end the podcast this week, I definitely want to thank our Patreon supporters. Thank you so much at the director tier to Rajeev, Narayan, and Andy Cooper, and at the executive producer tier, Christopher Lawrence. And of course, thank you to everybody else that is a supporter on Patreon at the producer tier or otherwise. If you want to know their names, I read them out once a month for the producer tier, and it's always listed in the show notes. I welcome your feedback via email to, once again, hello@ev-resource.com. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will catch you next time.